For a further perspective on this, let's bring in senior legal affairs reporter at Politico, Josh Gerstein. His latest piece covers how a top federal judge in Minneapolis delivered a brutal condemnation of ICE for repeatedly defying judges' orders in cases stemming from the Trump administration's immigration crackdown in that state and around the Twin Cities. Josh, good to see you. Let's just start more broadly. You were watching along with us there as Tom Homan spoke. What were some of your major takeaways? Definitely slightly different rhetoric, but still projection of toughness in terms of a deportation policy. What struck you?
Well, Jonathan, I think, Homan is trying to straddle the space between the hardliners in the White House, the Stephen Millers of the world, and possibly between President Trump and himself, who seems to have really changed his tone on these matters in the last couple of days. We do know that sometimes when the president sees images on TV that are emotional for him, he will react to them directly in ways that some of his more hardline advisors don't agree with. And I think that that's the mission that Tom Homan has been sent here to find some kind of middle ground. Some of the things you were talking about that Homan is saying that they need from the state are things that the state says they've been largely providing. I think the governor's claim is that when people are released from state prisons who are foreigners who served a serious sentence there, they are notifying ICE and they are turning those people over to immigration. I think the devil is in the details here. We're probably talking about people that are in state and county jails, places like that. And also, remember, ICE wants to come in and pick up people that haven't been convicted of any crime, that have just been maybe arrested or accused of something, might be a relatively minor offense. And I think that's a direction that I'd be really surprised if the state of Minnesota is willing to go.
Yeah, I was struck also, Homan, critical, or he said that, well, I'm not here just for showboating or photo ops, which I think some, my phone anyway, suggests read as a swipe at Secretary Noem, who we know has been criticized for doing just that, and the two of them don't have the best relationship. So let's talk, as best you know, Josh, this idea about the prisons and the handing over, what's sort of legality there? We know that the state has filed a number of lawsuits to try to stop, some of these ICE operations. What would a deal there potentially look like? Do you think it's something that the state would go for?
Well, I think the state is probably willing to show a little more flexibility, maybe to figure out a way to rope in the county jails where I understand a lot of inmates are kept rather than in state prisons, and make those people available for ICE to get out of the country if that's the way ICE wants to focus its operations. But I just don't think ICE is going to be able to get the numbers that people like Stephen Miller have been exhorting them to get simply through picking up people that are in the process of being released from, county jails in Minnesota. There's just no way. The only way they've been able to get the numbers that I've heard of around thousands of people, several thousand people over the course of the last month or so, is to pick up people that have been arrested on minor charges, or some people that haven't been arrested on any charge. There are also people that are just sitting at home who maybe had some kind of an infraction or arrest, or maybe even a conviction several years ago, that have been picked up in this operation. We know there have been children and others picked up as well. So they aren't going to be able to achieve the goals that the hardest of the hardliners in the White House have set out for them numerically, but maybe they can come to some kind of compromise here that lets both sides walk away saving a bit of face.
Yeah, Stephen Miller, no sign his influence has waned, and he's the one setting those quotas. Josh, let's turn to your recent piece about a judge there who ripped really a blistering words about ICE. Tell us more about that and their significance.
Well, he's not just any judge in Minnesota, Jonathan. He is the chief judge of the district court in Minnesota. He's also a Federalist Society member, or at least he was when he took the bench. He was appointed by George W. Bush, so he is not an ultra-liberal judge, or however the administration wants to characterize him. But he said in a series of recent orders that his patience with ICE is at an end, and he suggested that his colleagues on the bench there agreed with him. He put out this extraordinary order last night that said ICE is not a law unto itself, and he attached a list of almost 100 court orders that he said ICE had violated in the last month since this Operation Metro Surge got underway. The violations mostly involve moving people from Minnesota to Texas or deporting them, even though there were court orders in place saying they couldn't be moved until their legal cases were resolved. And the judge became very frustrated with this. His colleagues frustrated as well. And he had initially called the head of ICE, Todd Lyons, for a possible contempt hearing tomorrow in Minneapolis. The judge has backed away from that now because they released the individual involved in that specific case. But it's pretty clear that he's trying to get the ICE officials on a shorter rope, a shorter timeline here to respond to these court orders.
Politico's senior legal affairs reporter, Josh Gerstein. Josh, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.